Alright, so welcome back to the next episode of my RPG recommendation series. And again, I want to remind everyone that this is not a top 10 list, and these are in no particular order, and that I'm omitting more popular choices, I guess. In this case, I didn't really omit that much. But, yeah. So this time around, we're going to be looking at one of my favorite classic systems, the TurboGrafx-16 and the PC Engine. And, sadly, the TurboGrafx-16 never really got the respect it deserved outside of Japan, I guess, at the time that it was released. So countries other than Japan didn't really get a lot of the fantastic RPGs that are on the system, which is, sad. But don't worry about it, because actually there are quite a few good TurboGrafx-16 games released that are RPGs in English. So... and a few in Japanese that are still playable even without knowing English, despite being RPGs. So keep that in mind. So anyway, let's look at my TurboGrafx-16 and PC Engine recommendations. When people think of absolute classic RPGs on the TurboGrafx-16, this game is probably the one that comes to mind.
Ys Book 1 and 2 deserves the reputation it has as a great RPG. Though the original two games were released in 1987 and 1988 respectively, they were released together on the PC Engine and the TurboGrafx-16 as a single game in 1989. I remember when I initially played them, I didn't actually know where the first game ended and the second game started because of the length differences in the two games, the first being markedly shorter than the second. But none of that really mattered though, as I enjoyed all of the time I spent with the game. First section of the game has you searching for the 6 books of Ys in order to defeat evil and unlock the secret of the floating continent of Ys. That's the entire first game, most of which is spent in Darm Tower. The second game starts seamlessly with Adol reaching the floating continent of Ys and having his quest to destroy evil continued. The fighting system involves running into enemies. That's essentially it, you just bump into them. You run headlong into battle, and as long as you pay attention to the angle you hit at and don't let enemies surround you or hit you from behind, you can defeat almost anything. If you're like me, you probably overgrind, and it makes defeating large swaths of enemies later on quite easy. Though, this isn't really a novelty now. At the time when this came out, people were absolutely floored by the animated cutscenes in this game. Being one of the first such console experiences most people encountered, the animations alone had everyone wanting to play this game. On top of that, the soundtrack, which makes full use of the Red Book audio capabilities of the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16, is legendary. For me, this is still one of the definitive versions of the game. Or should I say games? If you are just starting out with RPGs on the TurboGrafx-16 or PC Engine, you found your starting point. Ys Book 1 and 2.
The next game, Cosmic Fantasy II, was actually the first CD-based RPG I've ever played. When I first got my TurboGrafx CD, this was one of the first games I got with it, and the first that I sat down and played. It's also one of the first Working Designs games that I've ever played.
The initial impression you may get from the gameplay is that it's very similar to Dragon Quest, as you have a party of characters that march around in an overworld and also have first-person battles against rows of enemies. It's actually even a bit more simple than Dragon Quest though, because the battles are very simple and predictable. I'm pretty sure you can't miss an attack, though that goes for enemies as well. And beyond magic, there aren't any special attacks either. This might seem a little boring, but it does make the game more accessible for those who don't want to think about tough battles and more want to get into the story of the game. Luckily, the story for Cosmic Fantasy II is great. It does start you as an unlikely hero trying to save a kidnapped princess from an evil wizard. Pretty standard stuff, but there are twists that make it much more than that. There are cosmic hunters and time travel and some interesting and some annoying characters like that damn Pico the cat, and a lot of great looking animated cutscenes as well. It was probably most well known at the time for containing scenes with near nudity and a bondage scene in a jail as well. That's almost right at the beginning though. Not only that, there are tons of sexual jokes made throughout the game. It's kind of seems like it missed an editing process when it was ported over to the American consoles, but that's the benefit for everyone. There are actually 4 games in the Cosmic Fantasy series, but for me, Cosmic Fantasy II has an extra nostalgia value to it. It's also the only game in the series released in English. Another upside is that the game isn't so expensive now, and even less expensive if you get the Japanese release.
Cosmic Fantasy isn't the only series that didn't get a full release outside of Japan. In fact, there were other, more popular series that rivaled even Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest in their popularity, yet didn't get a single release outside of Japan.
In Japan, Tanga Macchio was one of the most famous RPGs of the 16-bit era. The first in the series, Jiraiya, was one of the first CD-based RPGs and was developed by Red Entertainment, who also had hands in developing Bonk's Adventure with Atlas. The sequel, Manjimaru, was released in 1992 and was a huge hit. The graphics were updated significantly thanks to the Super CD. The soundtrack was composed by Joe Hisashi, who is well known for composing soundtracks for various Studio Ghibli films. The characters are more interesting and iconic, and the goofy nature of the series really starts to stand out. As with many RPGs of the time, gameplay is not all that dissimilar to Dragon Quest in that you have an overworld and first-person fights. Though in these first-person fights, the sprites are huge and well-detailed. I don't think more than 2 ever appear on the screen at one time, but larger creatures will fill nearly the whole screen. The real fun of the series comes in the story, though. The main plot is essentially travel to new places and fight bosses, but the world and the characters make it interesting. Imagine the game world as a Japan called Jipang in this series, that's being described by someone who knows only vague facts about Japan and just adds in their own interpretations. This is kind of the running joke of the game, and it's played quite well. Tengai Macchio 2, Manjimaru, is definitely an RPG that is fun and colorful and really interesting overall. It's definitely a must-play for those with the system's CD add-on.
Though many of the RPGs of the time tended to have systems that were reminiscent of Dragon Quests, some took their inspiration from other places. Though technically I'd not consider this game an RPG or the game that inspired it an RPG, but there are many of you out there that would consider it an RPG, so for you guys I'm including this, one of my childhood favorites, Nutopia.
Well, anyone who plays Nutopia will quickly realize that it's essentially a Legend of Zelda clone. You control a single character wielding a sword and a shield on a top-down overworld. There are dungeons to explore to find medallions and fight bosses. There are secret rooms found with bombs or by burning bushes or pushing blocks. There's even a princess to save. This is essentially The Legend of Zelda, the TurboGrafx version. However, Nutopia, in my opinion, managed to exceed the Zelda games of the past in nearly every way despite being a clone. The game added some new weapons, including the very useful fire rod. The music is great for a HuCard-based game. The graphics are obviously leaps and bounds ahead of the NES Zelda games of the time. And as a kid, this was the Zelda sequel I wanted as opposed to The Adventures of Link, which I enjoyed, but markedly less so than the original and Nutopia. The game itself plays exactly how you'd expect it to. Enemies wander about and are fought in a top-down view. Bosses tend to be strong and take a bit of strategy and effort to defeat, though once their patterns are determined, they get decidedly easier. The game environments are also quite nice. They're varied and colorful and pleasing to look at. If you enjoy these kinds of action-adventure games, you can't really go wrong with Nutopia.
Up until this point, every RPG I've talked about has been a single-player affair. Though a vast majority of RPGs only work as single-player games and are mostly preferred that way, there are some examples of RPGs that work well and maybe even better in multiplayer.
That brings us to Dungeon Explorer 2. Developed by Atlas, this is the 1993 sequel to Dungeon Explorer, also for the TurboGrafx-16 and PC Engine. For those unfamiliar with the gameplay, it's a lot like the arcade classic Gauntlet, where you control a character through a maze while killing monsters and their related monster generators. Unlike Gauntlet, however, the Dungeon Explorer series adds RPG elements including stats, levels, and boss battles. There's also a town to visit and an overworld to explore to get to new dungeons. Not only that, there's a large list of characters and secret characters that can be used and upgraded. There are 8 standard classes: Fighter, Hunter, Wizard, Dwarf, Elf, Cleric, Bard, and Thief. And these can be upgraded to Knight, Sniper, Warlock, Dwarf Lord, High Elf, Hermit, Rogue, and Master. Not only that, there are 6 secret characters, Witch, Monk, Princess, Robot, Beastman, and Engineer, giving you 22 total classes. There may be more, but that's all I could find. Because it's an action dungeon crawling game like Gauntlet, the inclusion of multiplayer for up to 5 people makes the game a lot more fun to play with friends. It's also nice to have that extra firepower when you meet some of the rather challenging bosses in the later half of the game. The game has nice visuals as well, lots of side quests and hidden missions, and an excellent soundtrack. It's a great combination of old school arcade style action and RPG elements, and is definitely recommended.
Okay, so the next game is going to get confusing. Okay, that's not really true. The game itself isn't exactly confusing, but explaining anything about the game is confusing, so I feel that I need a chart or a graph or something to help you guys out, but I'm not going to make one. However, before we get into that, let me introduce the game.
Dragon Slayer 8: Legend of Xanadu was developed by Falcom for the PC Engine and released in 1994. Though it's in the Dragon Slayer series, which also includes Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu, it plays less like that game and more like Falcom's Ys games. Despite having the name Xanadu, it's not a sequel to the original Xanadu, which itself actually spawned a sequel, Xanadu Scenario 2, and a side story on the Famicom, Xanadu. It's instead the 8th part of the Dragon Slayer series, to which the original Xanadu is the 2nd part. It too has 2 parts that are connected. Still with me there? I don't even know if I am. The game is played somewhat similar to Ys, where the battles mostly involve you running into enemies until they die. The first game also has side-scrolling areas before bosses, where the fighting is similar to the side-scrolling battles in Ys 3, where you actually have to push buttons to attack, though those are removed in the second game. The leveling system is different though, as you don't have levels per se, but you get stronger with weapons and skills the more that you use them. The story revolves around you being a descendant of the legendary hero Aeneas, being tasked to lead troops into battle versus the evil monster armies of Kakos. That's almost all the story actually, but though that's because there is a sequel, and the story is actually continued in the sequel, Legend of Xanadu 2, which is the final Dragon Slayer game and the second in the Legend of Xanadu games, which is not a sequel to the original Xanadu, but is a sequel in the Dragon Slayer series to which Xanadu is part of. I think I just confused myself there. So the sequel, it looks better than the original. Takes away the side-scrolling areas before bosses, though the boss fights are still side-scrolling, and instead provides a lot of spectacular-looking boss battles. The general system is still the same, but the story sees you searching a new continent 3 years after the end of the last game for your lost friend, who was in the first game. Of course, there is more to it than that, but that's the general gist. Personally, I prefer the first half to the second half as it's longer and more difficult, so I'd recommend that one. However, if you aren't into higher difficulty and just want to play a fun game, you can start directly on the second. I suggest both to get the full effect though, obviously.
Have you ever come across a game where the premise is just so awesome that it pretty much carries the entire game? I don't mean a bad game that failed, but a game that's generally not bad, but excels because the premise is just so great. This next one is one of those.
Last Armageddon was originally released for Japanese computers in 1988, but received its PC Engine as well as Famicom ports in 1990. The game has one of the coolest concepts I can think of for an RPG. First, the setting of the game is post-apocalyptic, but not nuclear so much as the atmosphere of the planet became toxic to all humans and animals, causing them to melt and die. The only remaining creatures are monsters and demons who aren't affected by the toxins. Since your party is made up of various monsters, there has to be something else for enemies. In this case, it's robots and aliens. Yes, this is an epic RPG where monsters fight robots and aliens for the control of the planet. That's the basic idea behind the game though. The system is quite interesting as well. You actually have 3 parties of 4 monsters that are controlled separately. You have a day team and a night team, as well as an end of the month team, which is used in a larger block of time than the other 2 teams. As you can imagine, this is not a game for people who don't like to grind levels, as each party is leveled separately. Really, the game contains a lot of interesting story elements and ties together seemingly bizarre events in a coherent way in the end that makes the game really enjoyable. It's got enough charm and enough straight-up awesomeness to overcome the slight flaws it might have. And those flaws mostly are related to the high encounter rates and the high level of grinding you have to do to really level your characters up. But beyond that, definitely play this game. It's totally awesome.
One thing I can say about the PC Engine is that it has a large amount of quality action RPGs. The next recommendation, in my opinion, is probably one of the best on the system.
Blood Gear, released on my birthday in 1994, was developed by Westone, who is probably most famous for developing a lot of the early Wonder Boy titles in conjunction with Sega. The game itself, though, is split into two types of gameplay, a top-down overworld and a side-scrolling action areas, not unlike The Adventures of Link, or Exile, or even more aptly, Wonder Boy 3. The overworld areas are where you wander around visiting towns and various other locations to progress the story and upgrade your mech. The side-scrolling areas are where the action takes place. You gain experience by defeating enemies, and those experience points can in turn be used to upgrade various parts of the mech you are using. It's not necessary to upgrade the mechs entirely, but if you're like me and you have an unquenchable thirst to do so, this can be time-consuming if you're a completionist, but it's perfectly possible to clear this game without upgrading all the way. There are multiple mechs and each has their own upgrade limit, so it's really up to you what you want to do with them. The graphics in this game are great. The more you play, the more you'll notice how good everything looks. Some stages have some nice parallax scrolling, the bosses are huge, and the stages make great use of the expanded color display of the PC Engine. There are also a good amount of animated cutscenes, which is nearly expected on CD games. On top of all that, the story for the game is actually pretty good. It's essentially your mech pilot taking on evil galactic forces, which might seem a bit like Star Wars, but, you know, there are some shock surprise moments towards the end that make it good. Best of all, despite being an RPG, it's quite easy to play without any knowledge of Japanese. This one's a winner for everyone, and should definitely be picked up and played if you get the chance.
The next game is one that was something of an RPG anomaly of the time. Well, just look at the cover here. It features artwork by H.R. Giger, and you can tell that, just by looking at it, that Jaseiken Necromancer is not going to be similar to other RPGs of the time.
The first thing you'll notice about this game that made it different from some more popular RPGs on systems like the Famicom is that the character sprites are somewhat realistically proportioned. The monsters are less along the lines of cute Dragon Quest slimes and are more along the lines of entrail-dragging zombies and flesh-eating butterflies, and also blood sprays from enemies when they die. Beyond that, the maps and environments are more dark and creepy than what came before it. It's a fantasy RPG, yes, but a horror fantasy RPG, so there are healthy doses of monsters and gore to go with your swords and magic. Not only that, the game takes huge influence from the works of H.P. Lovecraft, so you'll be running into boss fights with Yog-Sothoth, Hastur, Nyarlathotep, and Azathoth. And on a side note, if you recognized any of those names, you're probably as big a horror nerd as me and are probably now doubly excited to play this game. The music also stands up pretty well. There are multiple areas where the PC Engine chiptunes have been handled in a way that they give the perfect creepy atmosphere. Overall, the only real downside I can think of for this game, and a lot of the games I'm recommending as well as old school console RPGs in general, is that the encounter rate and the amount of necessary grinding might be somewhat unbearable to the weaker of you. This kind of thing never bothers me as I was brought up on this kind of thing, but just take warning. However, this game is nearly perfect in my eyes.
The final game I'm going to recommend you is one of the most underrated RPGs I can think of. Barring a few others that have retoolings that will show up in later videos, it's definitely one of my favorites on the system.
There isn't much I don't like about Emerald Dragon, and it's unique enough that I actually have trouble saying what kind of RPG it is. Generally, these kinds of things are based on the battle system, so something like Ys is an action RPG, while Shining Force is a strategy RPG, etc. However, the first thing you notice about Emerald Dragon is that the battle system is actually a combination of those two games. You have turn-based battles for each character, and each character has a certain amount of battle points to use in a turn. kind of like Shining Force. However, the actual fighting is action-based and mostly involves running into monsters, like Ys. Imagine a somewhat prototype version of the basic battle system in something like Eternal Sonata. The only thing of note is that the computer controls all of the party members and you control the main character only. Beyond combat though, the game has a lot going for it. The overall graphics are quite nice. There is something about the PC Engine graphics that are very distinctive, and of course, that exists here. There's rich use of color and the scenery is nicely done. On top of that, you have top-notch cutscenes interspersed throughout the story. The story itself really pulled me in. You have an overly evil white-haired bad guy to find and defeat, though I guess that gets a pass because the game came out before that was cool. But the real story is the connection between the two main characters despite their difference in species. There's actually a lot of touching moments throughout. The music is also pretty noteworthy. There's a mix between chip-based and Red Book audio, but the chip-based music tends to be good, and the Red Book audio is of course great. I actually have very little to complain about for this game. Even the encounter rates for enemies aren't over the top like some others on the list. For RPGs on the PC Engine, this one is really a must-play.
So, that wraps up another list of RPG recommendations. Hopefully you were able to find some interesting RPGs that you might want to take a look at. Next time, we'll be taking a look at the second system that has CD out on, the Sega Genesis / Sega Mega Drive / Sega CD. So be prepared for all the blast processing you can handle in RPG form. So until then, see you next time.